Good morning and welcome to Top Story. I'm Brian O'Neill. So many stories this week, wouldn't know which the top story would be. On to talk about all of them. State Senator Tom OMara, thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Brian. Thanks so much for having me on again.
Well, Senator OMara, wanted to start out with Dawn Smith. She works at the Bath VA. She was your choice for the State Senate's Woman of Distinction this year, 2016. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, she's got an outstanding career of community service, particularly for our veterans. You know, she's a veteran herself. She's worked for a long time at the Bath VA. She's been instrumental in just an amazing variety of veterans issues. One of the most recent ones in years that she's been coordinating the veterans event at Watkins Glen Racetrack during the 6 hours event up there that gets veterans into the track for some very outstanding racing and appreciation events for our veterans at those races. It's just a fantastic event, great opportunity for veterans, and she's been a driving force in that, and she just does a great deal of phenomenal work through the Bath VA for veterans throughout the region.
And I understand that Dawn Smith is a part of the May 28th Veterans Appreciation Day coming up in Hornell.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. That's good.
Yes. I'm sure a lot of people know her. I'm sure that, because you talk to somebody around here and they'll tell you, I'm going over to the VA today. So a lot of people go there for their care. So I'm sure a lot of people will be very interested and excited to hear that Dawn Smith at the Bath VA is this year's Woman of Distinction for the State Senate.
Yeah, we're going to have a great event up in Albany at the Senate where all the senators, awardees for the Woman of Distinction Award for this year that can be there will be there. They're individually honored for their service. It's really a very nice event, and I really look forward to having Dawn up to Albany and participate in that, but very proud to have had her nominated, and certainly with her credentials, was amongst the other nominees that there were. She rose to the top for this year's selection, and just an outstanding citizen.
State Senator Tom OMara, our guest this morning on Top Story. Moving on to another topic, a little bit less pleasant. The accusations against Governor Andrew Cuomo. Governor Andrew Cuomo is being investigated by Preet Bharara, the federal investigator. And Senator OMara, the accusation is against the one of Cuomo's former top aides and the money that went to the Buffalo Billion. And apparently the aide is accused of, I guess you'd say, taking consulting fees and then sending money to some companies' ways, and there was a conflict there. Wondering, Senator OMara, this sort of thing, from reading New York, let me put it this way, from reading New York One's Zach Fink, he seems to think that the former top aide is probably not guilty of this, and that this investigation is not going to go anywhere. What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't know any of the details, Brian. Certainly there's accusations out there, and U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara has so far followed through on investigations and accusations that he's had for public corruption, and he's been successful in those efforts. I know there's Joe Prococo that's involved with it. He was a right hand of Governor Cuomo's. In fact, worked for Mario Cuomo back when Mario was governor, and I think Joe Prococo and Andrew Cuomo have been lifelong friends, and they've been certainly very close over the years. So I don't know any of the details of these allegations other than what I've read in the news. So, I don't care to speculate on what the ultimate outcome may be of this, but I know that this Joe Prococo is one that at Mario Cuomo's funeral, the governor said he was like the third son to Mario. This is what Andrew Cuomo said at that time, and he joked it's probably his favorite son. So shows you the length of time and great relationship those two have had over the years.
Talking with State Senator Tom OMara. Another subject that came up this past week, Derek Roby's parents were in Albany talking about the Eric Smith case. They support your legislation that you and Assemblyman Phil Palmisano and Senator Young or others are working on to make it so that Eric Smith goes up for parole less often in order to make it more easy on the families who have to testify on why Eric should not be released. Wondering, how did things go with the Roby family?
Went very well. This was really an issue that really touches people's hearts with this. To see that a family of violent crime victim has to relive the ordeal in what right now is every 24 months, so every other year, parole revisits the question of release. What the legislation would do, and only really a handful of charges, probably the top 6 or 8 violent felony crimes that are out there, murder and sexual predatory crimes, would allow, and not dictate, but allow the Division of Parole to have a parole hearing no more frequently required than every 5 years as opposed to every 2 years, but still would allow the Division of Parole, if they saw circumstances that might warrant an earlier review for parole, to be able to do that. I think in a lot of these most egregious of cases where parole is not going to be likely, why should crime victims' families have to endure that reliving of that, and getting organized and prepared to testify and put submissions into the parole hearing to oppose that type of a release.
Senator OMara is our guest today. On the topic of fighting drugs, there was a huge drug bust in Schuyler County. I'm guessing that reaffirms your thoughts for the need for tougher legislation against drug dealers. Senator OMara, did any of that legislation that you were hoping for get passed in the budget this year?
It didn't get passed in the budget this year. We had a great deal of success last year in increasing penalties. There's still a few issues left to go that we'd like to deal with, and that would be treating the sentencing for heroin-related offenses the same as you would for cocaine. I'm sorry, including methamphetamines as the same as you would for heroin and cocaine in that regard. And also a big issue that I've been pushing for personally as well has been for law enforcement to be able to bring a homicide charge against a drug dealer that sells drugs to an individual that ultimately kills them. We've been seeing a lot of that with the heroin epidemic we have going around our state.
Why is that, Senator? Is it because the way the heroin is produced or packaged, or however you say it? Is it because the drug dealers don't know what they're doing when somebody puts the heroin in the bags?
Certainly, they what they do is called cut the heroin with other ingredients to spread out the heroin, but they're using some very dangerous other ingredients, such as fentanyl. Is one that is also a drug used as an anesthetic, but very dangerous when not properly used. And I think the drug dealers intentionally cut with these materials because it makes the drug more powerful and makes their product more desirable. But oftentimes it's so much stronger that it becomes very lethal for those addicts that get into a stronger strain of the drug.
That is a very scary piece of information, but an important one for people to know about. We're talking with State Senator Tom OMara here on Top Story. Going to break for just a moment. Back in just a moment with Senator Tom OMara here on Top Story. Back on Top Story, Brian O'Neill on the phone this Saturday morning with State Senator Tom OMara. Senator O'Mara, you have some legislation you've been working on about hiring veterans. Can you tell us about that and its status and how things are going?
Yeah, it's something we actually initially passed in 2013, and it provides tax credits to employers for hiring veterans, which is particularly helpful with the number of vets that we have had that have gone overseas and fought both Iraq and Afghanistan in recent years, coming back and giving an incentive to employers to provide jobs and employment to veterans. And those veterans have been finding difficulty upon returning home with a struggling economy that we've had during this period. That certainly a helpful aid for them. And this something that was expiring, and we were able to renew it, passing out legislation in the Senate to continue providing that type of a benefit will certainly help vets across the state be able to find gainful employment.
And you also have legislation for schools testing water for lead.
Yeah, Brian, we've had at least over in the more eastern part of my district, over in Ithaca particularly, schools that have found elevated levels of lead in their drinking water systems and in their kitchen water supplies that have really raised a lot of concern. And that we've come to find out that schools have not had any water testing requirements for checking the level of any type of these contaminants out there. So a lot of our older and aging school buildings probably still have lead fixtures in certain parts, and this legislation would require the Department of Health to come up with standardized protocols and timeframes for schools to do this type of testing and do it in a standardized way so that it could be monitored and checked before it's a problem, and to do it so that it's not an unfunded mandate, which I try to avoid in all circumstances. This under legislation I've sponsored with Assemblywoman Donna Lopardo out of Binghamton would allow the school districts to be reimbursed of this through the BOCES system, as they are with reimbursable aid and a number of other expense categories. So this really wouldn't be an unfunded mandate. We'd have a standardized process across the state because we really need to know that the kids in school are at a minimum getting clean and appropriate water.
And you're on the State Senate's Environmental Conservation Board, so that's very key. On the topic of schools, was just visiting with a friend of mine from New England. He was from Connecticut, and he says he really cannot believe the math lessons that his 12-year-old daughter is bringing home from school. And he said to me, I don't know if they have this in New York State, Brian, but there's this thing in Connecticut called Common Core. And he said, they're making the math lessons very difficult, roundabout ways of teaching how to add, subtract. He said his 12-year-old's having trouble multiplying. And I said, I've heard of Common Core. Don't have any kids. Didn't go through it myself, obviously, because it's newer. But Common Core, that's nothing. That's no big surprise to me. I've heard all the complaints. What's the latest on Common Core in New York State, Senator O'Mara?
I think we're seeing the Board of Regents and Department of Education transitioning to at least a better implementation. They're not going to be requiring as long of a test for the students to take in grades 3 through 8. I do highlight that the grades, the tests that are standardized, that are required to be given from grades 3 through 8, two of them in English and math in each of those grades, but they're required by the federal government and not the state government. But the state has, through the Education Department and Board of Regents, followed in recent years this Common Core and did a horrendous job of phasing that in or implementing it with very little guidance or real effective materials to be able to allow that. So therefore, Common Core was extremely criticized in its implementation and continues to be today. So I think we're going to see, with the changes at the Board of Regents, with a new chancellor in the Board of Regents and with a lot of several new Board of Regents members, we're going to see some significant changes in just how our education system responds to this new standard.
The new Education Commissioner, Mary Ellen Elliott, what she said so far about the Common Core implementation in New York State?
Well, she's really, I think backtracked a lot from where our prior Chancellor Merrill Tisch was, that understands that there have been a lot of problems with the implementation of this. I don't believe she's an opponent of Common Core, but certainly has been very critical in understanding of the way in which this has been phased in really quite inappropriately and ineffectively, I should add, more importantly than that we will be seeing, I think, significant changes in the process for the whole state education department.
Talking with State Senator Tom OMara, and some of that came out in some hearings that State Senator Kathy Young held several weeks ago. Senator Young, now the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and there were some very interesting hearings there. Speaking of Senator Young, we started out the year with hearings where she was grilling New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, and now we find that Mayor de Blasio is up to his eyeballs in a scandal involving Senate Democrats. Can you tell us about that, Senator OMara?
Yeah, this really broke last week. It just as the earlier scandal we talked about with Governor Cuomo and Joe Prococo. This has to do with Mayor de Blasio and trying to influence the outcome of New York Senate elections to try to help give the New York State Democrats the majority in the Senate. And what was allegedly going on, and in some of the races 2 years ago, it had been complained about that the governor was funneling much larger than allowed contributions that could go to an individual candidate, but funneling those contributions to the local county Democrat committee, which is allowed to give higher contribution limits to candidates. So kind of doing an end run on the direction of campaign contributions over and above what was allowed. Still under investigation. We'll see where that goes, but again, that's another one that both U.S. Attorney Barara is looking into, as well as the Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance is investigating now as well. So that is alleged improper use of campaign funds and directing higher than allowable contribution limits to Senate Democrat candidates.
Been talking with State Senator Tom OMara, the Big Flats Republican, also on the conservative and independent lines. Senator OMara, any final thoughts before we go?
No, we're coming into the final 2 months of legislative session this year, and we're back in Albany this week after a couple-week break after the budget. So it was nice to be home for a couple weeks, but we'll be going back to Albany every week till the close of session and wrapping up what probably will be a lot of legislation over the next few weeks to get that done for the session. But I don't see really a whole lot of major things coming. I know we've got some issues. We've talked about a couple corruption cases here today that are going on, and certainly looking at ways that we can crack down and deter this type of corrupt activity that we've seen far too much of. And one of those main areas is getting to a resolution that we really agreed upon last year in the state budget, and that is the forfeiture of pensions for those individuals that are found guilty of public corruption. Something that we should have passed last year. The Senate, we did pass it last year, pursuant to an agreement with the governor and the Assembly. But the Assembly didn't follow through with that agreement last year. They changed the bill, passed something different, and so we're back to square one. It's something that has to pass two successive legislatures and go to the public for a referendum to change the Constitution. In this regard, is something that is warranted to do. We should do it, and I'm hopeful that we're successful with that prior to the end of session this year.
State Senator Tom OMara, thank you for joining us. Always great having you on.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be with you.
ABC is next on AM 1480 WLEA Hornell.